In 1934, Arizona sent 100 armed National Guard soldiers up the Colorado River in wooden ferry boats because its governor believed California was stealing his state's water in broad daylight. Newspapers called them the Arizona Navy. That happened. Today, people call the result Parker Dam, a shining example of two states sharing the Colorado River. It is not. It was built by California, financed by California, engineered for exactly one customer. Arizona did not get a working straw into that reservoir for 47 years. I work in water systems, and you need to understand what shared actually meant here. Okay, let me back up, because the official version of this story is way too clean, and clean is usually the first sign that somebody smoothed something over. The public version goes like this. Parker Dam on the Colorado River between Arizona and California was built in the 1930s as part of a coordinated federal effort, alongside Hoover Dam, to bring water and power to the Southwest. Two states, one river, one shared solution. That is the postcard. I want to be precise here, because the actual paper trail does not read like a partnership. It reads like one customer's private infrastructure that a second customer had to fight, sue, and eventually retrofit their way into. Here's the first thing that should bother you. Construction ran from 1934 to 1938, and it was carried out by the Bureau of Reclamation using money advanced by the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, an agency representing 11 cities including Los Angeles, Burbank, Pasadena, Anaheim, and San Bernardino. In 1931, MWD voters had already authorized a $220 million bond issue specifically to build the Colorado River Aqueduct, the pipeline that would carry water from this exact reservoir to the Pacific coast. Construction on that aqueduct started in 1932, 2 full years before reclamation broke ground on the dam that was supposed to feed it. Sit with that sequence for a second. California built the delivery pipe before the source dam existed. That is not caution. That is a BET. That is a state building a straw into a glass of water it did not yet have any confirmed legal right to drink from a state legislature away. And that bet is exactly what set off the part of this story nobody teaches in school. In November of 1934, Arizona's governor, Benjamin Baker Moyer, found out that construction on Parker Dam was happening partly on Arizona soil, and he did not send a letter. He sent the National Guard to confirm it, and once they confirmed it, he declared martial law and called up a much larger force. 100 soldiers, armed with rifles and machine guns, were loaded onto wooden ferry boats and sent up the Colorado River to the dam site. The press mocked them as the Arizona Navy. Moyer embraced the nickname. This was not a symbolic protest. This was a sitting governor treating a concrete pour as an act of invasion. I keep coming back to that image because it tells you everything about how equal this project actually was at the moment it was built. You do not send machine guns to defend your seat at a table you were already sitting at. You send machine guns because you were never invited to the table in the first place, and the only way to get a seat was to make continuing the project physically impossible without you. That standoff forced negotiation. Arizona allowed construction to continue in exchange for a portion of the water stored behind the dam and federal funding for its own projects on the Gila River. And I want to be fair here, because on paper, that sounds like a resolution. It was not. Arizona still refused to ratify the Colorado River Compact, the underlying agreement that was supposed to govern who gets what from this river, until 1944. 10 more years of holding out. The dam got its concrete. The dispute did not get its ending. Those are two very different things, and the public story collapses them into one. Now here's where I want to slow down, because this is the part that gets skipped in every version of this story that treats it as ancient history. Parker Dam has a physical detail that almost nobody talks about outside engineering circles. It is, structurally, the deepest dam in the world. 73% of its 320-foot structural height sits below the original riverbed. Crews excavated 235 feet down into the Colorado riverbed before they ever poured foundation concrete. That is not a fun fact. That is an engineering decision, and every engineering decision answers to a specific problem. Here is why that depth matters. You do not dig 235 feet into a riverbed for symbolism. You do it because you need bedrock, and you need bedrock because you are building a structure that has to reliably hold back a reservoir feeding a single, specific, gravity-fed pipeline heading to Los Angeles. The entire hydraulic logic of this dam, from the depth of its foundation to the layout of its outlet works, was solved around one withdrawal point. One customer, one direction of flow. Nobody was engineering a second exit for a second state, because in 1934, there was no legal framework that said a second state got one. That is not a minor detail. That is the whole case wearing a smaller hat, because it explains everything that had to happen decades later. Let's stay with the money and the agencies for a second, because accountability in water projects always runs through a contract, and this one is no exception. The contract for Parker Dam was let by the Bureau of Reclamation on August 25, 1934. The financing was Metropolitan Water District money. The aqueduct receiving the water was a Southern California creation, a man-made river running roughly 240 miles from this reservoir to a terminal near Riverside, then onward to 13 member cities. Every dollar, every mile of tunnel, every design choice in that early chain points toward one coastline. Arizona is not in that funding structure. Arizona is not in that engineering brief. Arizona, at this stage, is real estate. The project happens to cross. I know that sounds harsh. It is also just what the record shows. And it did not stop at construction. By 1961, 23 years after Parker Dam was finished, and still more than a decade before Arizona had any physical intake of its own, the Metropolitan Water District had already expanded the Colorado River Aqueduct to its full delivery capacity, 1,212,000 acre-feet a year, more than 1 billion gallons a day, flowing to Southern California. Think about the sequence there. California was not just first. California kept scaling up its own straw, year after year, while the interstate legal question of who else was entitled to that same reservoir was still completely unresolved. That is not a state waiting patiently for a fair outcome. That is a state operating like the outcome was never really in doubt. There is also a hydropower piece to this that almost never makes it into the postcard version. Parker Dam has its own power plant, and the electricity it generates is marketed by the federal government's Western Area Power Administration to cities as far away as Los Angeles. So this dam was not only moving water in one direction, for decades it was also moving electricity in one direction. Generated on a river, Arizona was still fighting to get its own legal share of same dam, same river, same asymmetry, just measured in kilowatts instead of acre feet. So what actually resolved this? Not the 1938 completion date, not the 1944 ratification. The real reckoning took 18 more years to even start, and it did not happen in a legislature. It happened in the Supreme Court. In 1952, Arizona filed an original action against California in the United States Supreme Court, demanding a formal division of Colorado River water. Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and the federal government all intervened. A special master was appointed. He conducted years of hearings. This became one of the longest and most expensive cases in Supreme Court history, running 11 years and costing the parties close to $5 million just to litigate. In 1963, the court finally ruled, setting Arizona's annual apportionment at 2.8 million acre-feet, California's at 4.4 million acre-feet, and Nevada's at 300,000 acre-feet. A formal decree followed in 1964. Ask yourself the obvious question. If Parker Dam had genuinely been built to serve two states from day one, why did it take a special master, 11 years, and $5 million in legal fees to determine who was even allowed to touch the water sitting behind a dam that had already existed for a quarter century? You do not need a Supreme Court decree to clarify a partnership that was real from the start. You need one to force a partnership that was never actually built. And here's a layer that complicates the whole two-state framing even further, because it turns out this was never actually a two-party story to begin with. The same Supreme Court case recognized that when the United States created the Fort Mojave, Chemehuevi, Colorado River, Fort Yuma, and Cocopah Indian reservations along this river, it had reserved not just the land, but water to irrigate that land, and that those rights dated back to when the reservations were established, decades before Parker Dam, decades before the Metropolitan Water District, decades before anyone was arguing about acre-feet in a courtroom. The court found those water rights counted as present perfected rights with priority under the law. So the honest count is not two states quietly negotiating a shared resource. It is two states building infrastructure around a river where a set of older, legally superior claims existed the entire time, and were never part of the original 1934 design conversation either. There's a third party in this too, one nobody puts on the anniversary plaque. Under a 1944 treaty, the United States is obligated to deliver 1.5 million acre-feet of Colorado River water to Mexico every year, and the storage and flow regulation that makes that delivery possible runs straight through the same chain of dams, Hoover, Parker, and Davis. So when people say Parker Dam serves 2 states, they are not just skipping Arizona's 4-decade wait. They are skipping a set of tribal water rights that predate the dam and an international treaty obligation that runs through it. 2 states was never the real shape of this system. It was always more crowded than that, and the postcard version only has room for 2 names on it. That ruling is what finally cracked the door open for Arizona to get real physical access. And this is where the story gets, professionally, kind of infuriating, because the fix was not a redesign of Parker Dam. It was a bolt-on, built somewhere else on the same lake, decades later, to solve a problem the original engineers never had to think about. Here's the sequence. The 1963 decision cleared the legal path for the Central Arizona Project, which Congress authorized in 1968. But authorization on paper is not the same as concrete in the ground, and Arizona still had to wait for that too. On May 6, 1973, 35 years after Parker Dam was finished, a groundbreaking ceremony was held on the shore of Lake Havasu, and construction began on the Havasu Intake Channel Dike and a new pumping plant on the Bill Williams River arm of the lake, originally just called the Havasu Pumping Plant, later renamed the Mark Wilmer Pumping Plant. That plant was not finished until 1985 at a cost of $63.8 million. It uses 6 pumps, each rated at 66,000 horsepower, together capable of moving 3,600 cubic feet of water a second to lift Colorado River water 824 vertical feet out of the lake and into the 7-mile Buckskin Mountain Tunnel. Each one of those 6 pumps alone draws more power than the entire city of Lake Havasu uses on its hottest day of the year. That is not a modest add-on to an existing dam. That is an industrial-scale hydraulic operation built from scratch, because the original 1930s structure had no mechanism, none, for lifting water out toward Arizona. Sit with that number for a second, because it is not a rounding error. 824 feet of lift is not a technical footnote. It is the physical price of being an afterthought. And here's the twist inside the twist, the part that genuinely bothers me professionally. Arizona did not just get its intake late. It got its intake at a price. To get Congress to actually authorize the Central Arizona Project in that 1968 act, Arizona had to agree that its brand new Central Arizona Project water supply would be legally subordinate to California's 4.4 million acre-feet allocation in times of shortage. In plain language, if the river cannot supply everyone, Arizona's Central Arizona Project water gets cut first before California loses a drop. So the state that waited 47 years for physical access to this reservoir also had to accept, in writing, that its access would be the first thing sacrificed the next time the river came up short. That is not a footnote either. That is the state that fought hardest for a seat at the table, agreeing to sit closest to the door. This is not a settled piece of the past either. That subordination clause is exactly why, in recent shortage declarations on this river, it has consistently been Central Arizona Project deliveries taking the deepest cuts. First, not California's allocation. The 1968 compromise that finally let Arizona physically touch this reservoir is still deciding, right now, who absorbs the pain when the Colorado River cannot deliver what everyone downstream expects. The dam did not just get built for one customer. The eventual deal that let a second customer in was written so that customer would keep absorbing the shortfall first. Here's why that matters scientifically, not just politically. A reservoir engineered for one gravity-fed withdrawal is a completely different physical system than a reservoir also serving a high-lift pumping withdrawal on the far shore. California's original system just had to let water flow downhill into a pipe. Arizona's system had to be engineered around an existing lake, an existing shoreline, and existing sediment behavior that were never designed with a second intake in mind. That is not a small technology fit problem. That is building an entirely new hydraulic relationship with a 50-year-old lake and hoping the physics cooperates. And this is where I want to be honest about what we do and do not know for certain, because I am not going to pretend this part is fully documented in public. What we do know is that the intake channel required its own dike, specifically built to keep sediment out of the pumping plant's approach channel, which tells you sediment behavior at that shoreline was already a known concern by 1973. What we do not have confirmed, at least not in anything I can point you to directly, is exactly how much reclamation had to adjust operating pool levels at Lake Havasu once that second intake went active. That is a real open question, and honestly, it is the kind of question a properly resourced public records request should be able to answer. I am not saying nobody looked at it. I am saying the public record on that specific point is thinner than it should be for a $63 million hydraulic retrofit on a shared federal reservoir. Now, let's talk about what this retrofit actually costs every single year, because this is the part that gets buried under celebratory anniversary articles about the Central Arizona Project. The full Central Arizona Project canal system, the 336-mile aqueduct that carries this water from Lake Havasu all the way past Phoenix to south of Tucson, loses roughly 16,000 acre-feet of water every year to evaporation, and another 9,000 acre-feet a year to seepage through the concrete lining. Those are not small numbers. 16,000 acre-feet a year, gone to the desert air, plus 9,000 more leaking straight through concrete, every single year, indefinitely, as long as the system operates. That is not a footnote you skip past. That is the ongoing physical toll of building a 336-mile desert workaround, because the original 1930s infrastructure had no delivery relationship with Arizona whatsoever. Every acre-foot lost to evaporation and seepage is, in a very literal sense, the maintenance cost of a retrofit. It is water Arizona is paying to lose annually because its legal right to the river arrived 35 years after the concrete did. I want to connect this back to what people actually see today, because that is where the public story does the most damage. Go stand on Lake Havasu right now, and it looks like exactly what people assume it is. A calm, popular reservoir, boats everywhere, Lake Havasu City on the shore, families fishing off the bank. It looks settled. It looks like infrastructure that was planned this way from the beginning. None of that surface calm tells you that the lake's entire original engineering logic was built around a single gravity pipeline to a coastal city 250 miles away, and that everything Arizona draws from that same lake today runs through equipment that did not exist for the first 35 years of the lake's life. That gap is not ancient history either. The Central Arizona Project delivers roughly 1.4 million acre-feet of water a year, and Reclamation's own figures credit it with helping Arizona's population nearly double in the roughly 30 years after the system was finished in 1993. Phoenix and Tucson's modern water supply, the water underneath one of the fastest growing regions in the country, runs through a 1970s and 80s hydraulic patch job bolted onto 1930s bones. That is the actual infrastructure reality behind a headline that says 2 states share a dam. Think about what that means for an ordinary household in Phoenix or Tucson right now, filling a glass at the tap, with absolutely no idea that the water in that glass had to be lifted 824 feet uphill through a mountain tunnel, because the reservoir it came from was never designed to send water their direction in the first place. Nobody standing at a kitchen sink is thinking about a martial law declaration from 1934 or a Supreme Court decree from 1963. But the plumbing under that decision is still down there, still doing exactly what it was built to do decades after the people who fought over it are gone. And I want to be clear about what I am not claiming here. I am not telling you the water in Phoenix or Tucson is unsafe. I am not telling you Parker Dam is structurally unsound. It is not. The bedrock engineering is genuinely sound, and it has held for nearly 9 decades. What I am telling you is that the story people repeat about this dam, the tidy version where 2 neighboring states built something together, is not what the record shows. The record shows 1 state building first, a 2nd state resorting to the National Guard just to slow it down, an 11-year federal lawsuit to sort out the legal question, and then a $63 million retrofit decades later just to physically get the 2nd state's water out of a lake it did not design. Here's the standard of care question I keep landing on, because I think it is the most useful way to hold this whole story together. A competent, forward-looking water manager sitting down in 1934 with an interstate river and 2 states with legitimate legal claims, does not design a system around exactly one of them and call the argument settled later. That is not a management plan. That is a wish with invoices attached to it, and the invoice, in this case, took 47 years and a Supreme Court decree to actually get paid. I am not saying the engineers who built Parker Dam in the 1930s did anything scientifically wrong. The foundation work is genuinely excellent. Digging 235 feet to bedrock in that riverbed with 1930s equipment is a real engineering achievement. Full stop. What I am saying is that excellent engineering was pointed at exactly one client, and the story we tell today quietly edits that client list to 2, when the actual historical and legal record shows 1 state building, 1 state suing, and 1 state waiting, almost half a century to get equipment of its own bolted onto somebody else's lake. A properly managed interstate river system does not work like this. It does not let one party build a 240-mile aqueduct before the underlying legal rights are even settled, and it does not treat a second legitimate claimant's access as a problem to be solved decades later with a high-lift pumping plant instead of a problem to be solved at the drafting table in 1934. That is the actual standard of care failure sitting underneath this whole story, and it has nothing to do with concrete quality. The concrete is fine. It is the planning table that was missing chairs. So where does that leave us, as of right now? Parker Dam has not changed. It is still the same structure, still anchored 235 feet into that riverbed, still built around the same one-directional hydraulic logic it had in 1938. What changed is not the dam. What changed is who was eventually, legally, physically allowed to touch the water sitting behind it, and that permission did not come from good planning. It came from a governor calling up his National Guard, an 11-year federal lawsuit, and a $63 million pumping plant lifting water 824 feet uphill because nobody designed a downhill option for the second state at the table. The dam never changed. Only who was finally allowed to touch the water behind it did, and every gallon Arizona pulls out of that lake today still has to climb 824 feet to make up for a design that never planned for it to be there.